The carriage left before Cecily Vane had fully descended the step. She heard it behind her, the lurch of iron-rimmed wheels on frozen gravel, and the coachman's click to the horses, and she did not turn to watch it go. Her stepbrother Aldous had paid for a single night's conveyance, no more, and she had understood since the papers were signed that no one in the vehicle expected to collect her again. She was to be delivered. She had been delivered. The arrangement was complete. November had arrived at Dunmore Park ahead of her. The oaks lining the approach had shed their last leaves weeks earlier, and the park lay gray and bare under a sky the color of old pewter, the stone of the great house catching no warmth from it, offering none back. She stood on the sweep with her small trunk and her father's leather satchel, and the brass pocket watch ticking steadily inside her apron pocket. And she looked up at the house as one looks at a fact that has already become true. The footman who appeared in the doorway did not come forward to assist her. He stood at the top of the steps with the expression of a man who had been required to stand at that door before, and had watched other women descend other carriages. His eyes moved over her in a single pass, her plain gray traveling dress, the apron folded beneath her satchel strap, the absence of hat boxes and leather portmanteau, and something closed in his face. She had seen that closing in faces before. It meant he had already calculated how long she would last. Behind him, in the shadow of the open door, a man stood still. She would not have seen him, except that everything else in the doorway moved slightly. The footman's coat shifted. A leaf skittered past the threshold. The pale curtain to the left of the frame stirred. He did not move at all. He stood with his hands at his sides and his face turned toward her, and he watched her walk up the steps with the expression of someone who has learned to look at things without allowing the looking to show. One lean jaw, a scar along the left side, thin and old, silver white against the weather-dark skin. Gray-green eyes that did not soften and did not harden and did not look away. Cecily Vane had been told, on 4 separate occasions in the fortnight since the papers were signed, that the Earl of Dunmore had broken 6 companions in 14 months. She set her foot on the first step. She had nowhere else to go. If this is a story you have been waiting to hear, stay with it. It does not begin with triumph. It begins with a brass pocket watch and a woman who had learned that patience, properly applied, was the one thing the world could not buy back. She had been the 3rd daughter of a solicitor of moderate reputation and immoderate warmth, and when he died, on a Tuesday in August, a quiet exit that suited him, the warmth had gone out of the house in a single evening, and the moderate reputation had converted almost immediately into moderate debt. Her stepbrother Aldous managed the estate. That was what he said when anyone asked. He managed it, and the management required funds, and the funds were most efficiently sourced from Cecily's quarterly wages at whatever household would accept a gentlewoman's companion with no connections, no portion, and a letter of character from a country vicar who had died 2 months after writing it. She had applied to 3 households before the agency placed her at Dunmore. 2 had declined without interview. The 3rd had interviewed her for 11 minutes and then asked whether she was in good health, as if health were the primary virtue required for the position. And perhaps, she had thought, at Dunmore it was. The story that preceded her was not complicated. The Earl of Dunmore had lost his wife 3 years ago and had become, in that loss, a man who could not tolerate the disruption of his household. He was cold. He was exacting. He communicated his requirements through his housekeeper, Mrs. Farrow, and did not speak to companions at table unless he wished them to perform some function, and the functions he wished performed were narrow and unwelcoming. His young son, Thomas, who was 4 years old and had not spoken a word since his mother died, lived in the nursery and was not to be disturbed. The previous 6 companions had lasted between 3 days and 6 weeks before resigning their positions. The sixth had left on a Thursday morning without collecting her final wages, which was the detail the agency woman had delivered with a particular look. Lady Prentice, the Earl's maternal aunt, managed the social requirements of Dunmore when the Earl would not manage them himself. This was how it was phrased. Cecily would learn in her first week that the phrasing was precise. Lady Prentice managed, and what she managed was not merely the social calendar, but the definition of what Dunmore required, and what Dunmore required, in Lady Prentice's careful construction, did not include the presence of a solicitor's daughter in a plain gray dress who had been purchased for a quarterly wage. Mrs. Farrow, whose full name was Mrs. Elspeth Farrow, who had kept her Christian name and had kept the mourning black she wore when the Countess died, and who wore it still, met Cecily in the entrance hall and took her trunk from the footman without a word to him, and spoke to Cecily directly. Her voice was dry and precise, and contained, somewhere in it, the echo of a Northumberland girlhood. She told Cecily that the nursery was on the second floor, east corridor, that the boy ate at 7:30 and slept at 9, that his lordship did not require her to dress for dinner unless Lady Prentice had company, that her room was adjacent to the nursery. She said all of this walking, and Cecily followed, and neither of them looked back at the man still standing at the open door. He watched them go. She felt it between her shoulder blades like the first cold of a room when the fire has been allowed to die. Her room was small and clean, and looked onto the stable yard. The wallpaper was a faded blue that might once have been cheerful. There was a writing table, a narrow bed, a wardrobe that smelled of cedar, and a previous tenant's lavender water. She set her satchel on the table and took out the brass pocket watch and wound it, as she did every morning, as her father had done every morning before her, and the small clicking sound of the mechanism filled the room and then settled into the steady tick that had meant, for 23 years, that the day was beginning in order. She thought of Aldous at his breakfast table in the house in Bath, tallying her wages in the ledger he kept for purposes he did not explain to her. She placed the watch on the writing table and began to unpack. Lady Prentice found her in the corridor on the second evening. She was returning from the nursery, Thomas having not looked at her and having not screamed, which Mrs. Farrow had indicated was a qualified success, and Lady Prentice was coming from the opposite direction with Miss Isolde Pembridge, who was staying for the week and whose morning dress was the precise shade of blue that Cecily's room had once been, before the light had worked on it for 20 years. Lady Prentice was perhaps 60, upright as a post, with the expression of a woman who had decided her verdicts early and revisited them rarely. Miss Pembridge was perhaps 25, with dark eyes and the comfortable manner of a woman who had been told since childhood that rooms rearranged themselves around her when she entered. They walked past Cecily without acknowledging her. She was 3 steps beyond them when she heard Lady Prentice say, her voice not lowered, "The agency sent another one, you see. A woman paid to endure. They rarely last past the first fortnight." Miss Pembridge said something soft that Cecily did not hear. "No, my dear," Lady Prentice said. "Not a companion, precisely. Something rather less." Cecily turned the corner and kept walking. She had been told she was rather less before. The information was not new. What was new, and what she sat with that evening in her small room with the watch ticking on the table, was the precision of the phrase, "A woman paid to endure." She had been paid to endure her stepbrother's management of what had once been her father's house. She had been paid, in a smaller coin, to endure the 3 weeks between her father's death and Aldous' arrival with the ledger. She had perhaps been in training for Dunmore without knowing it. She wound the watch. She stayed. The first companion had left after the dinner table, where she had attempted to engage the Earl in conversation about the autumn shooting season, and he had looked at her with the gray-green eyes and said nothing for so long that the silence acquired its own temperature. The second had gone after Thomas screamed, a high, sustained sound that had brought 3 footmen running and had broken 2 panes of the playroom window glass with the sheer, focused pitch of it, and she had been packed by the following morning. The third had submitted her resignation in writing and left it on Mrs. Farrow's desk. The fourth had lasted 6 weeks, which was the record, but she had spent those 6 weeks in a state of quiet and escalating misery that she described to the agency woman as the peculiar desolation of being unnecessary in a house full of need. Cecily had heard this from the agency woman in the form of a warning and had understood it instead as a description she recognized. She made her approaches to Thomas slowly. She did not speak to him directly for the first 4 days, but worked around him, straightening his books by size along the nursery shelf, winding the tin soldier's mechanism while he watched from across the room, reading aloud to herself in the chair by the window, as though it were a private occupation that happened to take place in his vicinity. On the 5th day, she took out the pocket watch and set it on the floor between them and began to count the ticks aloud, not performing it, not inviting him, just counting quietly, as if counting were the thing and the boy were simply in the room. He counted 17 ticks after her before she heard him. She did not react. She kept her voice even and continued counting, and felt in the region of her chest something that had nothing to do with professional adequacy. Aldous arrived at Dunmore on the 14th day. He had written no letter. He appeared in the morning room where Cecily was sorting Lady Prentice's correspondence under instruction, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and his particular expression, the one he wore when he believed he was conferring a favor, and said, "Sister, you are looking well. The northern air agrees with you." He required his quarterly payment in advance. He had a debt. The creditor was becoming unpleasant. He phrased this in the language of inconvenience rather than desperation, as he always did, because Aldous was the sort of man who could not afford to be seen to need anything, even by the person he was requiring it from. He had come because Lady Prentice had written to him. Cecily understood this without being told. He had come because Lady Prentice wished to know whether Cecily could be removed, and removing a woman from service required the participation of whoever had placed her there. She gave him the wages she had been paid thus far. She did not give him the advance. She said this quietly, standing in the morning room with the correspondence sorted in her hands, and Aldous' face performed several rapid transitions before settling on affronted dignity. "You are a woman paid to endure," he said, "and it came out ugly, stripped of Lady Prentice's drawing-room precision, and for that reason it landed more accurately. That is what you are here for. You might at least endure graciously." Mrs. Farrow appeared in the doorway behind him, with the expression of a woman who had been managing difficult people in doorways for 30 years. Aldous left. Cecily set the correspondence on the desk and went upstairs to count ticks with Thomas. It was on the 19th day that the Earl spoke to her directly for the first time. She was in the library, having gone to return a letter she had found on the floor by the reading chair. A letter she had not opened and had not looked at past the address, which was written in a woman's hand on paper that had been unfolded and refolded many times, and he was standing at the window with his back to the door. And he turned when she entered, and looked at her with the gray-green eyes and said, "What are you doing in here?" She set the letter on the desk. She said, "Returning that, my lord. I found it on the floor. I thought you might want it found without anyone knowing it had been found." A pause. Long enough to have character. "Go," he said. It was not cold. It was the tone of a man whose composure was contingent on the management of his own spaces, and she had breached one. She understood the distinction. She went. He had watched her leave differently than he had watched her arrive. The body does not lie when the mind is too disciplined to admit things. She noticed in the weeks that followed that the fire in her room was always lit before she reached it, though she had not requested this. The chair in the nursery that she had moved to the window for better light had not been moved back. When she had mentioned to no one, not even Mrs. Farrow, that Thomas had begun to eat better when his meal included a small dish of stewed apple, the stewed apple appeared at breakfast the following morning, and every morning afterward. He was not present for these adjustments. He did not speak of them. They were there, and she was not a woman accustomed to inattention who could mistake it for something else. She noticed also when he stood at the nursery door. She did not see him immediately. She was reading to Thomas from a volume of natural history, the chapter on the migration of swifts, and Thomas was lying on his side on the rug with his eyes half closed, one small hand curled loosely around the face of the pocket watch she had placed within his reach. And she was using her father's reading voice, the one that had cadenced her own childhood into sleep. The long, unhurried sentences that never quite fell at the end of a clause, but carried the weight forward. She heard nothing. She felt the quality of the room change, the particular way air shifts when a door is open that was not open before, and she kept reading, her voice level, and did not look up. Thomas was asleep in 6 minutes. She had never managed it in under 12. She set the book on the arm of the chair and looked at the door. The Earl was gone. If you have ever waited to be seen by someone whose seeing might cost them something, wait. She did not know yet what she was waiting for. The pocket watch was ticking, and Thomas was asleep, and the door to the corridor was ajar. And those 3 facts felt, for the first time, like the beginning of something rather than the end of it. She did not permit herself more than that. She learned the shape of his wound the way one learns the shape of a room in darkness, by moving through it slowly, by what the edges feel like against an outstretched hand. Mrs. Farrow told her without telling her, which was Mrs. Farrow's preferred method of communication. She said, when showing Cecily the East Corridor on the 4th day, that the portrait there was the late Countess. The door beside it is kept locked. She did not say what was behind the door, and she did not say who had locked it, and she did not say how long it had been locked. She said those 2 things and walked on. The portrait was a fair woman, slender, dark-haired, with an expression that contained both warmth and a quality of looking elsewhere, as if the painter had caught her in the middle of a thought she had not yet finished. There was a locket at her throat. There was a piano suggested in the background of the canvas. The plaque beneath the frame read, Elspeth, Countess of Dunmore. No dates. Cecily had stood before it for perhaps 3 minutes one morning on her way to the nursery, not long enough to be seen doing it, and understood something. The piano was not played in this house. She had thought it was the Earl's preference, or his aunt's. It was not preference. It was the specific silence of something locked. He had loved her. That was the wound. He had loved her, and she had died doing the thing their life together had required of her. And he had been left with a small boy who could not speak, and a house full of faces that reminded him that he had not been enough to prevent it. He drove the companions away, not from cruelty, but from the desperate instinct of a man trying to reduce the variables in a world where too many variables had already killed someone. She did not say this to anyone. She held it alone, and it changed the way she walked through the house, the way she took up less space than she otherwise might have, the way she never, not once, tried to open any locked door. She thought of her father, who had also believed in the discipline of the closed room. Some griefs want a door, he had said once. by which he meant some griefs require a place to live that is not everywhere at once. Dunmore's grief lived behind the locked door. She wound the watch. She kept counting ticks. The winter assembly at Pembridge Hall fell in the second week of December, and the Earl was required to attend it, and Cecily was required to attend as Lady Prentice's companion, and Miss Isolde Pembridge was required to be everything that the ballroom could illuminate her as being. Lady Prentice had been building toward this evening for 6 weeks with the patience of a woman who understood that architecture required patience, and the architecture was simple. Isolde in ice blue at the head of the receiving line, the Earl returned to his social function, the contrast with any alternative too obvious to require statement. Cecily had pressed her best dress that afternoon. It was cream muslin with a green sash, and it had been her best dress for 3 years, and it was still her best dress, and it was everything Lady Prentice's architecture required it to be, which was visible inadequacy. She stood near the wall. Isolde was magnificent. She was the kind of woman who had been told since childhood that rooms arranged themselves around her, and rooms, being rooms, had done so reliably enough that she had stopped noticing it. She moved through the assembly with her dark eyes and her ice-blue skirt and her prepared warmth, and the Earl stood at the edge of the room and watched her with the expression of a man performing the specific courtesy of not being elsewhere. Cecily noticed this. She noticed also that he had looked at her once when she entered the ballroom. A single look that began with recognition and continued past it into something she did not name. She did not permit herself to name it. It was Lady Prentice's great friend, Mrs. Aldecott, who said it. She was standing not 3 feet from Cecily with her back turned, speaking to 2 women whose names Cecily did not know, and she said it in the carrying voice of a woman who had never had occasion to lower hers. "The Dunmore companion," she said. "One assumes she has outlasted the others by virtue of making herself invisible. A woman paid to endure usually becomes very good at disappearing." Isolde Pembridge, passing at that moment on the arm of an eligible young baronet, turned her head and looked at Cecily, and said, with the pleasant precision of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing, "Yes, I expect that is quite the talent for such a woman." The room absorbed it. Cecily absorbed it. She thought of the watch in her apron pocket, ticking steadily, indifferent to ballrooms. She stood near the wall and did not disappear. The brooch was reported missing on the morning of the 15th of December. A small pearl piece, Lady Prentice's, of moderate value and significant sentimental attachment, which Lady Prentice described to Mrs. Farrow in a voice that trembled with the appropriate degree of distress, and which Mrs. Farrow reported to Cecily in the doorway of her room with the dry precision of a woman delivering information she did not endorse. The brooch had last been seen on Lady Prentice's dressing table. Cecily had been in Lady Prentice's room 3 days previously, delivering a letter. The household had been searched. The brooch had not been found. Aldous arrived the following morning. He had been sent for, Cecily understood at once, by Lady Prentice, for the same reason he had been summoned previously, and for a reason that had now acquired procedural weight. She stood in the doorway of the study and looked at the 2 of them. Aldous with his hat again, and his expression set to the pained stoicism of a man performing reluctant family duty. Lady Prentice at the window in her best gray and very composed. And she looked, last, at the Earl. He was behind his desk. His hands were folded on its surface, and his face was the face she had learned to read through architecture rather than surface. Nothing given, everything present. The scar along his left jaw caught the winter light from the window behind him. He said, "Miss Vane." She said, "My lord." He said, "You understand why you have been asked here?" She said she understood. Do you have anything to say? She looked at him. The gray-green eyes were looking back at her, and they were not cold, precisely. But they were present in a way that was almost difficult to sustain. She thought of the fire in her room, always lit. She thought of the stewed apple. She thought of the nursery door, ajar. She thought of a man who drove companions away not from cruelty, but from the mathematics of grief. She thought of Thomas asleep with his hand around the face of the pocket watch. She thought of her father, who had also not been enough to prevent the thing that had happened, and who had never once stopped treating those around him as though they deserved to be looked after. She said, "No, I have nothing to say." Aldous exhaled the breath of a man who had been holding it in readiness for a negotiation and had discovered the negotiation was unnecessary. He said, "Then I think we must settle the question of severance." She reached into her apron pocket for the pocket watch. She placed it on the desk in front of her, on her side and not his, because she was not offering it but setting it down so that her hands would be steady. And she looked at it for a moment. The small brass face, the scratch on the winding crown from the corner of her father's desk, the second hand moving with the indifference of all things that continue. She said, "I should like to collect my coat." She did not cry. She was the third daughter of a solicitor, and she had been trained early in the particular dignity of receiving verdicts one could not contest. And she received this one with the stillness of practice. She turned. Behind her, the Earl said one word. "Wait." The word was not loud. The word was not a plea. It had the quality of a command issued by a man who had realized, in the space between one sentence and the next, that he had been within a single moment of making an irreversible error, and that the weight of his own silence had been about to become the worst thing he had ever permitted. She turned back. He was standing. He had not been standing a moment ago, and the standing changed the geometry of the room, the angle of the winter light on his face, the way the desk no longer sat between them as a piece of furniture of authority, but simply as a piece of furniture. He looked at Lady Prentice with a precision she could feel from where she stood, and Lady Prentice's fan stopped moving. He said, "The brooch is in your room, Aunt." A silence. "I found it this morning on your mantel, where you placed it when you changed your dress on Tuesday evening. Mrs. Farrow can confirm the date and the hour, as she was in the room with you." Lady Prentice said, "Marcus, you are being ridiculous." "Mrs. Farrow," he said, still looking at his aunt, "please ask her to come." Aldous was edging toward the door. "Mr. Vane," the Earl said, and Aldous went still. "You placed your sister here for wages and convenience, and you have come twice now to remove her at another person's instigation. I think your interest in her situation has been sufficiently demonstrated. We need not explore it further." Cecily picked up the pocket watch from the desk. It was still ticking. Mrs. Farrow appeared. She confirmed the date and the hour and the mantle and the dress in 4 sentences without expression. Lady Prentice left the room in the posture of a woman who has not lost an argument, merely found it necessary to be elsewhere. Aldous left without his hat. The Earl looked at Cecily. He said, "You did not defend yourself." She said, "I did not think it would accomplish anything." "It would have accomplished a great deal," he said. His voice was level, and underneath the level was something that had not been there in the first weeks, or perhaps it had been there and she had been too careful to read it. "It would have told me that you believed I was capable of hearing it." She was quiet. "I have not," he said, "given you reason to believe that." She said nothing, because what there was to say was the kind of thing that could not be said in a study in the middle of December, with the winter light coming through the window and the pocket watch ticking in her hand. What there was to say was that she had believed it. She had believed it, and then her wound had spoken, as her wound always spoke when the thing she most feared most approached, and she had let it speak for her instead. She said, "No, you have not. Not directly." The third day after the brooch's restoration, the Pembridge Winter Assembly convened for its final evening, and Lady Prentice attended with Miss Pembridge and 3 other members of the county's assembly, and the Earl arrived an hour after the doors opened, and Cecily was not required to attend. She was in the nursery with Thomas. They were counting ticks. Thomas had by this point learned to count to 47 before he lost interest, and he had communicated this preference not in words, but in the particular way he looked at her when the count went past 47, a faint pinch at the bridge of his nose that Cecily had come to understand as the Thomas equivalent of adequately, which was enough. She heard the carriage on the gravel at 10:30. She heard, from the floor below, the sound of voices, Lady Prentice's carrying and high, then a lower register she did not at first recognize as the Earl's, and then a third voice, Isolde Pembridge's, which was not loud but was clear in the way that a bell is clear. Each syllable struck. She continued counting. Then she heard, through the floorboards and the plaster and the cold December house, the Earl's voice rise into something that was not quite loud and was not quite steady, and she recognized in it the specific note of a man who had decided. Thomas looked up at her. She said, 48. He looked back at the watch. She learned what had been said 3 days later, from Mrs. Farrow, who delivered the account in the manner of a woman completing a record, rather than reporting gossip. The Earl had arrived at the Pembridge Assembly late, because he had driven first to the county magistrate's home to deliver a document. The document was a settlement of engagement, properly witnessed and legally registered, and the name on it was not Miss Isolde Pembridge's. He had walked into the Pembridge ballroom and found Lady Prentice at the center of a cluster of county matrons describing the terms of a match she had arranged between the Earl of Dunmore and Isolde Pembridge, and he had stood in the doorway until the room looked at him, which rooms do, and he had said, into the turned attention of perhaps 70 people, and the particular stillness of one woman in ice blue who had believed her entire life that rooms arrange themselves around her. Miss Vane is to be my countess. That is settled. Lady Prentice had said, later, in the carriage, that he had behaved in a manner she could not account for. He had said he could account for it. She had said, "The girl is a woman paid to endure. She has nothing." He had said, "She has everything that matters in this house. I suggest you reconsider what you mean by nothing." The formal announcement came quietly, as all true things in that house came, not by declaration, but by procedure. A letter to Aldous, who had the grace, or the prudence, to write back congratulating Cecily with the warmth of a man who had not been entirely certain the arrangement benefited him, and had decided it did. A notice to the county. Mrs. Farrow, who received the intelligence with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for a thing to be confirmed that she had known since the 19th day. She told Cecily in the doorway of the nursery. She said, "His lordship would like to see you in the library, at your convenience." His convenience, Cecily understood, but she went when Thomas was settled, and the watch was wound. And she stood in the library doorway, and he was already there, standing at the window as he had been the first time she had entered this room. And he turned when he heard her, and did not say anything for a moment. She said, "You did not ask me first." "No," he said. "You registered the document before you asked me." "Yes." She looked at him, at the unreadable face that she had learned was not unreadable. That was merely a face that had decided to stop performing itself in front of people who had not earned the performance. the scar along his jaw. The gray-green eyes, which were currently doing the thing she had first noticed from the bottom of the front steps on a gray November morning, which was looking at her in a way that contained considerably more than looking. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because I have made errors by hesitation before. I did not intend to make another." "That is not an explanation," she said. "That is a defense of your method." "Yes," he said, "you are right." He was quiet for a moment, and the quiet was the kind that had weight, not the Earl's managed silence, the one he used as a social instrument, but something older and less practiced. The silence of a man reaching past discipline toward something he had not reached for in 3 years. "I watched you read to my son. I watched you find the letter I had dropped and leave it on my desk without having read it. I watched you accept 2 accusations you did not deserve without raising your voice. And I watched you place your father's watch on the desk as if you were making sure you would remember what mattered in case the rest of it went wrong." She was very still. I thought, for approximately 17 seconds, that I might still make the error, he said. Then I thought of what it would cost, and I found that I was not willing. The fire was burning behind him. The winter dark was at the window. The library smelled of leather and coal smoke, and a faint trace of the lavender she had come to associate with the housekeeper's linen chest, which was not quite the same as home, but had gradually, without her permission, become something adjacent to it. She said, "You might have asked." "I might have," he said. "I was not sure you would have believed that my asking was about what I wished, and not about what was practical." "You have been given reason," he said carefully, "to assume that what people ask of you is about what is practical." She thought of Aldous and his ledger. She thought of the agency woman's expression. She thought of the 4th companion, the one who had said there was a peculiar desolation in being unnecessary in a house full of need, and she thought how wrong the woman had been about the thing she had named. The desolation had not been in the need. The desolation had been in believing oneself unable to meet it. She said, "Marcus." It was the first time she had used his name. She had not planned it. It came out with the weight of a decision that had been building since the 19th day, when she had set a letter on a desk, and walked away, and felt him watch her leave differently than he had watched her arrive. He crossed the room in 3 strides, and stopped when there was perhaps 2 feet of warm library air between them, and they stood there, in the firelight, in the December dark, and neither of them spoke for a moment, because some things, when they finally arrive, do not want words immediately. He said, "Cecily?" She said, "Yes." Not to a question, to what it was. He reached out and took her hand, her right hand, gloveless, which had spent 3 weeks counting ticks with his son in the nursery, and smoothing his son's books onto shelves in size order, and returning letters to desks without reading them. And he held it in both of his, and she felt the warmth of his hands, which were not, as it turned out, cold at all. Thomas learned to say 4 words in the week before Christmas. They were not the 4 words anyone had predicted. They were not Mama, which was what the physicians had suggested he might eventually recover, or a name, which was what Mrs. Farrow had hoped for. The 4 words were again, and more, and now, and yes. He said yes in the garden on the 23rd of December, wrapped in his winter coat, standing in the thin crust of snow that had arrived overnight and stayed, and Cecily had said, "Shall we count again?" And Thomas had tipped his face up to hers and said, clearly, without hesitation, yes. She had made no great movement. She had taken his hand and begun to count, because that was what was asked for, and the counting was enough. and the fact of its being enough was a kind of grace she had not known to expect, and did not know how to receive, except by letting it be what it was. The Earl had heard from the doorway. She knew because she had learned, in 3 weeks of practice, to feel the quality of the air when the library or the nursery door was open that had not been open before. She kept counting. At 17, Thomas said them with her. That evening, the 3 of them sat in the library with the fire burning and the snow coming down outside the window in the slow, methodical way of English December snow that has no intention of hurrying, and Marcus read aloud from the same volume of natural history, the chapter on the migration of swifts that she had been reading when Thomas fell asleep and the door had stood ajar. And Thomas sat between them on the hearthrug with the pocket watch held loosely in his hand, and the clock on the mantel kept its own count, and the snow kept falling, and the locked door down the east corridor remained locked, because some griefs want a place to live that is not everywhere at once. And that was all right. That was the shape of this particular life. And it was enough. She had not been sold into endurance in the end. She had been given, by accident, a house full of need and the particular education that had made her the only person capable of meeting it. Marcus set down the book when Thomas's breathing slowed and looked at her across the boy's sleeping head, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything. And the pocket watch ticked steadily in Thomas's loose hand, its small counting filling the warm room the way her father's voice had once filled her childhood, regular and reliable. The sound of a thing continuing. She thought it was enough. She thought it was more than enough. She reached across and took the watch gently from Thomas's hand so it would not fall, and she set it on the hearthrug between them, and it ticked on, as it always had, indifferent to ballrooms and accusations and the cold gray exteriors of great houses seen for the first time from the bottom of a set of stone steps. It had been ticking since before she was old enough to understand what it was counting. It was counting now. If you stayed until the close of this, leave a word in the quiet below this story and tell me the moment you knew. This house keeps counting. I am grateful you were in it.